Hi, welcome to Taiwan Talks, bringing you the latest news from Taiwan. I'm Annie Cole.
I'm Rath Wang. Joining us today is a special visitor to Taiwan and longtime friend, John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton is a former national security advisor and ambassador to the UN under 2 U.S. administrations. Ambassador Bolton, a very warm welcome to the show today.
Glad to be with you.
You've mentioned extensively and repeatedly the importance of Taiwan. Why does Taiwan matter to the U.S. and democracy?
Well, Taiwan has proven itself to be self-governing. It's a major trading partner of the United States. Its supply of high-tech computer chips is critical to the information society we live in. And Taiwan as a functioning democracy really is an example of the kind of government that's successful for its people around the world. So the threat to Taiwan from China is not simply a threat to the interest of the United States, but the interest of all the countries in the region and really the world as a whole. And I think the threat has been growing, made clearer by the recent visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow and the axis now formed between China and Russia.
You mentioned that the U.S. hasn't done enough to counter Chinese aggression and ambitions on taking over Taiwan. What do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think there's a short term and a longer term. In the short term, I think we're all worried that Xi Jinping's hegemonic ambitions could lead to military action in the very near term, 2 to 5 years. I don't think that necessarily means an invasion of Taiwan. I think Beijing has demonstrated the possibility of throwing a blockade around the island and seeing if the U.S., Japan, and others step up to Taiwan's defense. So we don't know exactly what it would be, but the threat is real. So making Taiwan's defenses capable of resisting the attack, to make sure China understands the cost of any offensive military operation would be far greater than anything they could hope to gain from it. But over the longer term, this increased Chinese global threat really highlights that an opportunity for Taiwan to get closer political, military, economic relations with many other nations here in the region, but around the world as well. And over the long term, embedding Taiwan in more collective self-defense relationships makes it even less likely that Beijing will take hostile action. So there's a lot of work to do in the short term, but in the long term as well, to maintain peace in the region, but also preserve self-government on Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. And then just to ask, do you also believe that maybe it's also important for the U.S. to drop the notion of strategic ambiguity at the same time to be a little bit more clear on its stance?
Yeah, I think strategic ambiguity had a place when it was originally articulated, because at that time, ambiguity helped foster deterrence by China. Today, I think ambiguity encourages China to think the U.S. would not respond in Taiwan's defense, so it's having a negative effect. And just clarifying that the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense doesn't increase the possibility for hostilities. It diminishes the possibility for hostilities because it creates deterrence.
Mm-hmm. And, as a longtime advocate for reestablishing the diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Taiwan, at this point of time, do you still believe that this is a priority?
Sure, I've believed this since 2000. I wrote an op-ed in the Taipei Times, and I think that the reason is that that legitimacy in today's world for government comes only from the consent of the people. That's the only basis of legitimacy that I think we should accept. And to acknowledge the People's Republic of China and not acknowledge Taiwan is not realistic. Taiwan is a functioning, self-governing state. And it simply admits what reality is to have full diplomatic recognition. Now, Beijing may not like that, but it needs to understand that it lives in a complicated world too, and what it wants, it doesn't necessarily get.
Functioning and self-governing, indeed. If you look at the Taiwan democracy, there's actually an election coming up next year, the presidential elections. I've understand you met with both the KMT and the DPP here. What are your thoughts on next year's election?
Well, we have elections in the U.S. too, which makes it even more complicated. You know, one of the things that Taiwan has done successfully for a long time is foster good relations in Congress with both parties, Democrats and Republicans. This is a real strength for Taiwan. And by the same token, I think the U.S. has had good relations with both of the major parties here in Taiwan, and I think that's important too. So, so different politicians, different parties have different priorities. Some want to go in one direction or another. People of Taiwan will decide in January of 24 which direction they want to go in, and the U.S. will work with whichever party wins that election.
Ambassador, I wanted to go back to what you mentioned earlier on the importance of arming Taiwan and having U.S. troops stationed here. Some say that this could provoke China. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the only country that's provocative in the region today is China. Taiwan doesn't want a war with China. It would be foolish if it did. It's not engaged in provocative flights and naval vessels coming near Chinese territory. It's not sending drones near China. It's China that's trying to change the status quo. So the issue is, what can the U.S. do to help strengthen Taiwan and make it clear to China that this aggressive behavior is unacceptable? I think there are going to be a lot of weapons sold to Taiwan. I think that means that it would be helpful to have American troops here to train and assist Taiwan forces in becoming familiar with those weapons. I think it would be helpful to have American naval vessels here in Taiwan to be able to conduct freedom of navigation operations in the Taiwan Strait. There are many things that we could do that would show to China that if they did, for example, try to blockade Taiwan, there would be Americans behind that blockade as well. And I think that is not provocative to China. I think it deters China.
I wanted to go back to one of your quotes that you said a couple of days ago. What's provocative to China is that Taiwan exists at all. What does that mean?
I once saw a cartoon in one of the Taiwanese newspapers 20 years ago. Picture the mainland and an island. And on the island was a man with a ballot in his hand, putting it into a ballot box. On the mainland, there were tanks and airplanes, missiles, People's Liberation Army, and the PLA soldier on the mainland was pointing at the island, the man on the island, saying, "He's provoking me." And that's really what it comes down to. The idea of self-government is contagious. And we've seen what China has done, sadly, to people who believe that they should be able to participate in selecting their government. What they did to the one country, two systems approach in Hong Kong and violated their international commitments. So that's what's at issue here. And I think it's not Taiwan that's provocative to have free elections, have a free press, have a free society. But it's dangerous to Beijing in their mind, and that's what really worries them.
So you also talked about the threats that Russia and China have posed the U.S.-led democratic world order. So how immediate and how consequential do you think that is?
Well, I think the Russia-China axis, which we now see being formed, is very different from the Sino-Soviet alliance of the Cold War, because China is the senior partner and Russia is the junior partner. And I think they've got outriders like North Korea, Iran, Belarus, perhaps others. So it really is a major change in the geopolitical environment worldwide. It may sound like that diminishes the importance of Taiwan because China is threatening a lot of other countries as well. But the only silver lining in this is actually it shows how important Taiwan is, not simply for the people of Taiwan, obviously it's important for them, but how it fits into the bigger global picture as the principal point of potential Chinese aggression. So I think other countries begin to see that what happens to Taiwan affects them directly. I think you can see this very clearly in Japan, increasing in South Korea and other countries here, but also in Europe and elsewhere around the world.
Is this why you've said that Taiwan is the center of the gravity?
Right.
Right. Schwerpunkt is the German word, and that's really what China's focused on. So there's no missing the danger, the risk to Taiwan, but this is also an opportunity for Taiwan to extend its contacts with others in the Indo-Pacific region and elsewhere in the world, and make itself stronger by having more partners resisting potential Chinese aggression.
So if this is the case, how do you think that we can also stop the expansion or Chinese expansionism? What is your take on this?
Well, I don't think China is irrational. I think that if it sees weakness, it sees opportunity. So if Taiwan, for example, didn't seem to care very much about self-government, it would provoke the Chinese. But by Taiwan standing up, by having a more visible presence in the world, I think that does deter China, and especially deters Xi Jinping. He doesn't want to fail, because that could be regime threatening for him.
And also, we have your book, The Room Where It Happened, right next to you. In the book, you also described that former President Trump, his take and his measure to Taiwan was very incoherent and inconsistent. So what did you think that the approach went wrong under Trump administration?
Well, I don't think President Trump really appreciated all the issues that were involved. He saw China as a threat, but mostly a threat in terms of trade and economics. And it was very hard to get him to focus on the importance of Taiwan, even in economic terms, because of its status as a major U.S. trading partner and its role in microchips.
And also, we mentioned about the 2024 election that's going on in Taiwan very soon. Same goes with the U.S. You also mentioned that you do have the plan to also be part of the presidential election in 2024. So if this is the case, how would you treat China compared to the approach to China right now?
Well, I'm considering running. I haven't decided one way or the other, but I think it's important for the U.S. to be very clear that it supports Taiwan, that it's working in many different ways to make sure that China understands that it's not in their interest to try and challenge Taiwan's status, not to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, and that China would bear enormous cost if it did. I think this is what Ronald Reagan called peace through strength. It's not provocative to be strong, it's provocative to be weak, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
And in terms of how would you have done things differently? Because now we have the Democrats in the U.S., and if there was a Republican president coming in 2024, how do you think things would change?
Well, I think there'd be a much clearer understanding of the nature of the threat we're facing from China. But I'd also say even the Democrats are more aware of the threat than they were before. You know, in a very partisan United States, the one issue that really has bipartisan support is the threat from China. Now, we'll see if that stays together, but I think that it's important to have this debate in the 2024 presidential campaign. That's really the appropriate time.
And you talked earlier about how China is now the stronger partner in its partnership with Russia. Do you feel it's watching Ukraine closely, and what does it see in terms of the Taiwan context here?
Yeah, absolutely. If the West doesn't defend Ukraine, China will draw the conclusion that if we're not willing to do something on the continent of Europe, we won't do it in Far East. And that would be a big mistake. I think increasingly, even in Europe, people understand that a threat to Taiwan has an effect there. But I think in the U.S., support for Taiwan is overwhelming. And it's important that the government here continue to help inform people in the U.S. about what's at stake. And it's also why having this debate in the 2024 presidential campaign is important, so Americans know what we're facing. You have to treat your citizens like adults. You have to tell them the risks and the challenges that exist in the world, and what we need to do to protect America and protect its friends. And once you do that, then there's a very strong support for doing what's necessary.
So if you were to decide to run for presidential election next year, 2024, what would your Taiwan strategy be at the same time to also protect the U.S. national interest?
Well, I think a closer defense relationship with Taiwan is critical, providing necessary weapons, but also on the political front to make sure that other countries come to Taiwan's defense as well. And I think that requires very active American diplomacy.
In terms of the U.S. not being able to save Taiwan's recent diplomatic loss, as we've seen with Honduras, what do you say to that?
Well, it's hard when the U.S. itself doesn't have diplomatic relations. That's another reason for the U.S. to extend full relations. But I think Taiwan should look to the example of Israel, which for many decades had no relations diplomatically with its neighbors, but beneath the surface developed very close ties with many of the Arab states. And that's perhaps not the most satisfactory way to do it from a visible political point of view, but it stood Israel in good stead, and in due time, as we see now, diplomatic relations were to come. So it's really the practical steps for closer diplomatic ties, military ties, and intelligence ties, that if Taiwan can generate more activity, even if it's not public, it makes Taiwan safer.
But what do you think Taiwan needs to do here with the people, with the government, to make sure that, as you mentioned, the U.S. would be willing to lend its hand in, the scenario where Taiwan would be attacked by China?
Well, again, the purpose is to preserve peace through deterrence.
Right.
But one way for Taiwan to do that would be for the people to make it clear that they will fight for self-government. I visited Ukraine many times before the Russian invasion over a period of years. And the Ukrainians thought that when the Soviet Union broke up, they had achieved independence and they should have it. And it shouldn't be an issue for military conflict. And people wondered if the Russians did attack, what would the Ukrainians do? And I wondered myself. Now, we've seen what the Ukrainians have done. They have fought with great courage and great skill to defend their country. So they've set a high bar for others around the world. But I think Taiwanese prize their self-government. I think it's been a long time coming. It didn't come easily here on the island. It's a great tribute to the people of Taiwan, what they have achieved. And I don't think they want to give it up.
Right.
But I think it's helpful to find ways to make that clear. That's not belligerent to do that. That's simply standing up for what's been accomplished. And I think it has an effect on China as well. If they see that the Taiwanese are prepared to defend what they've accomplished, that will have a deterrent effect.
Do you think they're going to slow down, China will slow down on wanting to even have the initiative of attacking Taiwan if we're more certain of where we stand?
Yeah, I think you want them to recognize that the cost of taking military action would be far greater than whatever they could gain. And I think there's a risk in the near term because many people believe that as China's population has peaked and is now going down, they have an old, aging population, an insufficient workforce, the one child per family policies had a profound effect. And many people think that Beijing appreciates its power will diminish over the decades. So that the threat to Taiwan is now. If Taiwan demonstrates strength now, that pushes the danger further into the future where it's probably going to decline. So in the election campaign, I think politicians will have to explain how they see this to the Taiwanese, and if people in Taiwan really believe in self-government, they'll stand up for it.
And I think this is kind of a little bit more like a psychological warfare. People were saying that the more Taiwanese people stand up for themselves, probably even going to provoke China even more, but you think otherwise. But China has also released a couple of propagandas recently. So do you think this is just a buffer?
Well, I think the Chinese are going to try and influence the election in Taiwan and in the United States in 2024. They've certainly tried to influence prior elections in both countries. I think they're going to do it again. Hopefully, because they don't understand free governments, they'll mess it up as they have before. But I think this is another subject people should discuss. Do we get to decide who governs us, or are the Chinese going to try and influence us to the point where our people aren't allowed to express their own will?
In terms of influence operations, we've seen a lot of that from the Russians in Ukraine, and you said you visited Ukraine many times, and now you're in Taipei. Do you see a difference in the determination to protect the homeland between the Ukrainians and the Taiwanese?
Well, before the Russian invasion, it was not clear what would happen in Ukraine. Would the military fight? Would the people support it? At least to outsiders, it wasn't clear. And I think to the Ukrainian people, they saw what was coming, and we've seen over the last 15 months what their performance has been. So had they been clearer in their resolve earlier, perhaps that would have had an influence on the Kremlin that would have caused them to draw back and not invade. So I'm not saying the Taiwanese people need to be belligerent in the way they talk about it, but I think the determination, the willingness to have military service, to support increases in defense spending, and to do what's necessary to defend Taiwan and to prepare for the worst contingency helps avoid it.
But how serious do you feel China is about taking over Taiwan? As we've seen Russia's Putin talk about it for a long, long time, but there was a surprise attack. Do you feel that the Chinese could take example?
Well, I think if they see the cost to Russia translated into cost for China by trying to take over Taiwan, that's the deterrent that you're looking for. But it's also why my own view is that an actual invasion of Taiwan is not the most likely scenario. The most likely scenario is a blockade. So what they want is the full productive capability of Taiwan to be turned over to them without being destroyed in combat. And testing Taiwanese resolve through a blockade is one way to find out.
So do you feel the solution is to block that blockade, to find a way to make sure that that blockade doesn't happen?
Yeah, the best way to win a war is to prevent it. I mean, there are lots of things that Taiwan can do, the U.S. should do to help if it came to that. But I think as we've seen from the war in Ukraine, it's very damaging to the country. The cost in human terms has been high. And the best way to avoid having the war is to be so prepared to fight it that your adversary decides, I don't want to do it.
So do you mean that in order for us to block the blockade, we have to show that we are very prepared, like what you mentioned earlier? The more prepared that you are, it will be a better deterrence to China.
Right. The ancient Romans, not a civilization as old as in this part of the world, but the ancient Romans used to say, si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war.
So we're seeing what may actually happen, which is the blockade. But let's just say maybe what if, an assumption, there is a surprise attack. How would the U.S. respond to this?
Well, I think that goes to the question of removing strategic ambiguity. If the Chinese knew that there would be an American response, that reduces the possibility that they would attack in the first place. We've just seen President Yoon of South Korea visit Washington and have a discussion about the problem that is most acute for South Korea, the threat from North Korea, which has detonated 6 nuclear weapons. Now, in Korea, they are talking about getting their own nuclear capability or having United States tactical nuclear weapons redeployed on the peninsula. That would be the kind of deterrence that they believe would prevent a North Korean attack. Now, we're not talking about that here, but perhaps they should in South Korea. The Biden administration didn't agree to deploy tactical nuclear weapons, but said we would send nuclear ballistic missile submarines back to South Korea. First time in over 40 years that that's happened. And that is an effort, not enough in my view, but it's an effort to show North Korea what they face. and to back them away. So there are many ways to do this. Deterrence is a complicated subject, but certainly increased capacity is one major element of it. A second major element is the cost China would face economically if it tried to blockade or invade Taiwan. And I've said, and I believe, that the response of the industrial democracies around the world to an invasion or a blockade should be very strong. For example, calling for basically the excommunication of China from the international economic order. Now, many people will say, but that's a very strong response. Well, invading a free country is a pretty strong provocation.
And in your conversations in South Korea, how worried or how concerned are they about Taiwan?
Well, I think for many years, obviously, in South Korea, they were most worried about North Korea and China, perfectly appropriately. But I've seen in my recent visits, twice within the past year, a new awareness in South Korea that a Chinese threat to Taiwan really is a threat to South Korea as well. I think in Japan they already see that. So this is a kind of opportunity in the face of adversity, which is what Taiwan sees from China. But in the face of that, there are real opportunities to strengthen Taiwan's links, cooperation, and increase self-defense capability with others in the region.
Right, and so we talked about the Taiwan strategy all the way to South Korea and also Japan. So initially, during the beginning of the interview, we talked about the short-term and long-term goal that Taiwan should take in deterring China. Now, if we put it in a bigger picture, what do you think may be the U.S. short-term and long-term goals to diminish the threat of authoritarianism?
Around the world, there are different kinds of authoritarian regimes. Some of which happen to be on our side of this. This is not untypical throughout history. But I think the United States needs to take a much more active role in response to a kind of aggression that China has already committed. You know, for 30 or 40 years, China has been stealing American intellectual property, and Japanese and European and Taiwanese and everybody else they can get their hands on. And what they've done is use this intellectual property to build up Chinese industry. And so if you don't have to do research and development, if you don't have to take the risk of introducing new products, you can copy what others have done and then sell into their own markets at a lower price. So the U.S. and many others have been hurt for decades by this Chinese piracy of intellectual property, and we've done very little in response to it. I think that needs to stop. So what I've proposed is that the United States should prohibit the export into the United States from China of any goods or services that are based in whole or in part on stolen intellectual property.
Is that a short-term goal?
Well, I think that's a short-term step that could be taken that would have long-term effects. Okay. In fact, one criticism of that idea is that it would have such a dramatic economic impact on China. Well, maybe it would, but that's what shows how much intellectual property they've stolen.
Going back to deterrence, Ambassador, I wanted to ask you what you feel Taiwan needs in terms of defense articles that would show that Taiwan is determined to protect against the homeland.
Well, I think the weapons that have the greatest deterrence on China are the ones that can strike Chinese territory. It's 100 miles across the Taiwan Strait. That's a huge advantage Taiwan has that Ukraine didn't have because it has a long land border with Russia. So the ability to harm China at the source before the ships and the weapons actually arrive on Taiwan is critical. But I think this also underlines why there has to be much greater dialogue between Taiwanese military and American military officials. There's a lot of it going on now, but if you look at successful U.S. alliances with South Korea, Japan, NATO, we've been having complex military-to-military conversations for decades. So we're way behind, in a sense, in the level of conversation on Taiwan, the scope of it, the specificity of it, the depth of it. much better to speed up what's already underway now, because when the crisis comes, it really is too late. The preparations that are laid by closer consultation will pay off if there is a crisis.
Ambassador, you mentioned a few days ago the words of former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld that weakness is provocative. What does that mean in the Taiwan context?
Well, if the country is not seen as able to defend itself, that argues in Beijing that the cost of an attack or the cost of a blockade would be acceptable. But strength, which some people say is provocative, actually is what creates deterrence. So if you're not perceived as strong enough to protect or to fight against belligerents, that really encourages the potential aggressor.
And lastly, just to wrap it up a little bit, we talk about so many today, from Taiwan to Southeast Asia, the measures that we should take. As an advisor, do you have any suggestions for Taiwanese people when speaking of preparing ourselves in military approach? Economically speaking, should we also be more aggressively joining world organizations, for instance, UN or CPTPP, to also blockade? How would you suggest we do that? And what do you think may be the next step that we or people in Taiwan should take?
Yeah, the more diplomacy that Taiwan engages in, the better. And it's difficult because of the lack of diplomatic recognition. But I think people should look for practical consequences, not simply the political impact of full recognition. I think China has gotten every one of their neighbors along its long periphery worried. And I think that people in many different countries, in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, now see that an attack on Taiwan by China that succeeded would have an impact on their security as well. I think they want the United States to remain a strong partner in security in the region. I think it's in America's interest to do that, but I think Taiwan can do a lot on its own, growing closer to other countries. And there's a lot that Taiwan can provide by its experience, by its knowledge of Chinese intentions, and so it has a lot to offer. But all I can say is there's a lot of work to be done. And I think one useful aspect of an election campaign is that it helps educate the people. Tell them the risks that they face, tell them how we want to keep peace for Taiwan, and how doing it through a position of strength makes keeping peace much more likely.
How do people in the U.S. right now, or civilians, are actually looking at this matter?
Well, I think there's a lot of interest in the Chinese threat because of the balloon that floated across the United States, because of the influence of TikTok, many other things. We're understanding Chinese efforts to try and influence American opinion in ways that we haven't appreciated before. So this is a moment when, on a broad basis within the United States, the Chinese threat is very concerning. And so finding ways to help our friends and allies who are much closer to the threat, I think this is the moment to talk about that.
Thank you for your insights, Ambassador Bolton. Let's now hear from Vincent Chao, former Political Division Director at Taiwan's representative office in the United States. Vincent is currently Taipei City Councilor. Vincent, I just spoke with Ambassador Bolton as the director of the political division at Taiwan's representative office in the U.S. How are interactions with Ambassador Bolton?
Well, Ambassador Bolton's been a very consistent friend of Taiwan over the years. I mean, he served in the first, in the George Bush administration, George W. Bush. He went on kind of to work in think tanks when Obama was in office, and he came back as the National Security Advisor during the Trump administration. And I think throughout past decades, not years, but past decades, we've seen a very consistent approach to his support for Taiwan's democracy. And, case in point, when he was National Security Advisor, actually, we held the first ever kind of highest level public meeting between Taiwan and U.S. national security officials. So, for example, I accompanied our Secretary General of the NSC, David Lee, at the time, to the White House, where we had a very small, closed-door interaction with Ambassador Bolton. And Ambassador Bolton during the meeting was very gracious. And, I will say that, some people, whether it's in the U.S. but other countries as well, have really, grown their interest in Taiwan in recent years because of tensions. Not Ambassador Bolton. He's known this stuff for years and decades. He knows the whole history of this stuff. So he was able to come in the meeting and he was able to talk about all of these different issues that matter to the relationship. And I really think that having him here in Taiwan, not only speaking publicly, but also here on Taiwan Plus, and having him in the U.S. be such a forceful advocate for Taiwan-U.S. relations, I think that does help Taiwan's international exposure, and it certainly does help bridge kind of dialogue and discussions between Taiwan and U.S. interlocutors. Some of the key issues that he's been focused on in the past include security, include international space, and many of these issues really have set the stage for the relationship we see today. And sort of the stuff that he was talking about 4 or 5 years ago, if not longer, we're really ahead of the time, and we're really seeing sort of the administration take seriously really concerns about national security, about Taiwan's international space, about the economic relationship and how economic security is correlated with national security, and all of these issues that Bolton's been talking about for years and decades.
What policies did he talk about specifically in your meetings, going back to that?
So he was way ahead of his time, and way ahead of his time being that this was back, I think, in 2019 or 2020. I think it might have been 2019, actually. And he had talked about, for example, the PRC's timeline for modernizing the PLA, for ensuring that they're capable of bringing forward an invasion scenario. He talked very forcefully about this transition asymmetric, very forcefully about sort of the weapons and procurement that Taiwan really needs to think about, whether it's domestically, indigenously produced, or foreign bought. But in terms of anti-ship missiles, in terms of smart sea mines, in terms of capabilities that would make Xi Jinping think twice. So all of this was way ahead of his time, because we're seeing this in the news now in 2023, and maybe a bit earlier in 2022, but all the way 3-4 years ago, Bolton was talking about these issues. Ambassador Bolton was really, understanding in terms of the specific set of capabilities that would deter an invasion and ensuring that Taiwan would have those capabilities in place. So again, his consistency on Taiwan has stretched past decades. It's not a matter of years, it's been a matter of decades.
He's a good friend of Taiwan indeed. What are the current state of Taiwan-U.S. relations in your opinion?
Well, I would say it's precisely the sort of topics we had talked about when we had this meeting between Bolton and David Lee in the White House. And the first foremost issue has always been security, and how do we ensure that Taiwan is secure, and how do we ensure peace and stability will continue to be the case here in the Taiwan Strait. And so, that I think includes a whole variety of factors. Includes Taiwan's defense transition, how fast we move towards asymmetric. It includes having the resources in place. It includes having training from the United States. It includes the supply of not only weapons, but munitions. It includes reserve reforms. So all of these are issues, I think, that are very, very important, if not the top issue between Taiwan and the U.S. today. Second to that, we have economic issues. And I think there is a clear preference from our part in terms of engaging and pursuing an FTA with the U.S. And I'm quite confident, for example, that this year we will see some sort of conclusion to the 21st century trade discussions that have been brought forward. I think we'll see a very robust set of trade deals and trade principles that arise from that. I'm not sure if we're going to get towards tariffs. I think tariffs is a tough issue in the U.S. right now. Congress certainly has not made up their mind in terms of reauthorizing the administration to engage in tariff discussions. But as you know, Rath, there's a whole host of building blocks that goes into FTAs that are outside tariffs, right? Like market access, like IPR protections, like ensuring we have really robust discussions on how to resolve points of contention, on ensuring that we have not only encouraging aspects, but also regulatory aspects to facilitate investment between the two sides, such as a bilateral investment agreement. So there are a number of building blocks, and I'm confident we're going to work our way towards finishing each of these building blocks to ensure that we are ready for that tariff discussion when it arises. So trade is the second part. And I would say the third important part is international space. And we see this in Congress all the time, right? So Congress continues to advocate for Taiwan's participation in organizations such as the World Health Assembly, such as ICAO, the International Aviation Organization, such as Interpol. And I do think that the U.S. will continue to marshal kind of like-minded countries, democracies, in Taiwan support. So, again, regional security, cross-strait security in terms of international space, in terms of trade and the economy, I think these are the foremost issues we see between Taiwan and the United States today.
Going back to the bipartisan support that you mentioned, especially with Congress. There's been a lot of support for Taiwan. How much has the administration been on board, or is there more pressure now with the new select committee on the CCP to support Taiwan?
Well, I think the pressure has always been there. I think Congress is what they're really doing is they're becoming a lot more smart and disciplined in terms of how that support needs to come about. So, for example, I think in the past you see 435 members of the House, for example, and all of them would have different ideas about how to support Taiwan, whether it's through legislation, whether it's through individual, linkages, whether it's through meeting with Taiwanese representatives and so forth. But now I think people have coalesced around this idea of security, and that a really robust set of actions are needed fast to enhance Taiwan's security and enhance Taiwan's deterrence. And so I would say that on both sides of the aisle, it's not a partisan issue. It's very much a bipartisan issue. But above and beyond that, it's an issue a lot of members see urgency on. And so I do think that this set of bipartisan support we have in Congress right now would ultimately be a very, very helpful kind of force as we think about how the U.S. can help support Taiwan's deterrence capabilities.
Vincent, you talked about how Congress has become smarter in its approach towards Taiwan. How much of that is part of your good works and also the current top envoy in the U.S., Ambassador Chao team?
Well, I would say TECRO is a team. And it's a team led by a very capable and able ambassador, Chao Kim, and my former boss. And I think having worked with Ambassador Chao for over a year's time, I would say the key point she brings is clarity. Clarity in terms of mission, clarity in terms of how we can pursue this relationship, clarity in terms of what Taiwan needs from this relationship, clarity in terms of what the U.S. hopes to see. And so there's a lot of clarity back and forth.
How much has China helped in this aspect because of the common threat that we see towards democracy between, say, the U.S. and Taiwan?
Well, we have a saying in D.C., which is China is China's own worst enemy. And I think it's absolutely true because everything they do seems to shoot themselves in the foot. I would say that sometimes it's worth shooting in your foot if it's to achieve this larger purpose. But we don't see that. We just see them alienating themselves and making enemies in D.C. and being a diminished presence. And I'll give a case and example of that. So we saw, for example, this wolf warrior diplomacy that has been going on for months, right? And so this wolf warrior diplomacy, for example, they would send letters to members of Congress saying that, hey, you should not meet with Taiwan representatives because this would trample on the so-called One China principle and the bedrock of U.S.-China relations. And they're treating these members of Congress, frankly, like they're 5-year-olds. Like these members of Congress, they're not going to take what the Chinese say at face value, right? They're going to ask the State Department. They're going to ask the administration. So what is our policy towards Taiwan? And they're going to get an answer that, the U.S. doesn't have a One China principle. And the U.S. has always encouraged members of Congress to engage with their Taiwanese counterparts and the Taiwanese government officials. And this has always been a part of the Taiwan-U.S. relationship, after the Taiwan Relations Act in the 1970s. And so the Chinese really end up shooting themselves in the foot because they don't achieve anything, but they undermine their credibility. And they sound hysterical when they do it. So, just tell me what they accomplished. Nothing.
I want to move on to 2024. The U.S. is also having a presidential election, just like in Taiwan. If the next president is a Republican president, do you feel Taiwan policy would change?
I don't. I think it may change, obviously, because different presidents bring different sort of personalities to the board. I don't think it's going to change across the board. I'll put it like this. There is always concern, and there is always risk, and there's no use brushing those aside. I mean, we have to confront those head on. And the risk is that there has always been sort of an isolationist streak within domestic U.S. politics, whether it's on the right or on the left. And so, part of our job, I'm no longer a diplomat, but part of our job as Taiwanese and as people interested in public issues is to share this idea internationally that our security is directly correlated with the security of the U.S. It's connected. I mean, if something were to happen in Taiwan, if something were to happen to the first island chain and to kind of the presence here we see in the Pacific and something that upends the international order, that poses a direct threat to the security of democracy around the world, but also the security of people within the U.S. And so it's incumbent for people of any political party within the U.S., but also here in Taiwan, to support this relationship. And so I do think that if the Republicans were to come back, we will see, I hope, meaningful progress sort of continued progress on the defense end, ensuring that we have a ready supply of munitions and weapons and capabilities brought to Taiwan, to see we have robust support for indigenous capabilities, because we know that's important. Because if, for example, we do see a worst case scenario, things aren't going to come in and out. They're going to be reliant on what we're able to produce here in Taiwan. So building that industry is going to be important. But I think what we'll also see actually is we'll see a very strong signal towards China that any actions against Taiwan would be met with responses from the U.S., and hopefully these would be responses that give pause to the Chinese.
Thank you, Vincent, for all your insights. Let's now hear from Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute based in Washington, D.C., where President Tsai Ing-wen received the Global Leadership Award during her U.S. visit in March. To make sure that coercion and force doesn't happen and that China does not accidentally take the first move, do you feel Taiwan, the U.S., and its allies are doing enough to deter that?
No, because it is so difficult to know how much is enough for deterring China. But the answer, the longer answer, the elaboration on the no, is that the answer is not simply put more military assets around Taiwan or sell Taiwan even bigger weapons. That may be part of the solution. There is definitely a serious military dimension to all of this. And I think that's where the U.S.-Philippine exercise is so important in terms of providing credible combat capability, credible capability in the region, and not far from Taiwan. I think that is an important part of deterrence. But an equally important part of deterrence is to show solidarity internationally, that as the European Commission President von der Leyen said so eloquently in Beijing, and her remarks are not remembered, although they should be. We mostly remember President Macron's comments separately on the interview coming back, but her comments were very clear about you must not, because we will not accept. She was speaking for the European Commission, but indirectly for all of Europe. You must not use force to change the status quo, and that is an international position, and we need to make sure that that is maintained. I think that is the most effective line of deterrence, because I don't think the military instrument alone is going to stop China. At some point, if China really feels like they can change the status quo, they may be happy to incur massive losses if they think that they can isolate the United States or isolate Taiwan on that issue. But if we're aligned internationally on this issue, that we must not allow China to resolve this issue forcefully, I think that is the main deterrent.